At the airport, Jasmine was falsely accused of stealing a purse, and within minutes, she was unlawfully handcuffed in front of a crowd. That single moment nearly destroyed her career, her reputation, and her freedom. But what happened when they searched her changed everything. What shocking truth did the officers uncover? And why did it leave them frozen in fear? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett moved through Denver International Airport like a storm in silence. The winter chill outside had nothing on her presence. Sharp, composed, unshakable. Dressed in a black tailored vest and boots that echoed like closing arguments, she carried a worn leather case full of courtroom wars. Her eyes scanned the crowd. Calm, calculating, prepared. She wasn't just respected, she was feared in legal circles, known for toppling institutions and silencing corrupt power. But in this terminal, none of that mattered. Here she was just a black woman moving alone. No badge, no spotlight, just bias waiting to pounce. And it was already watching. Suddenly, a sharp scream tore through the terminal, loud enough to slice through the low hum of rolling suitcases and boarding calls. "My purse! My purse is gone!" It wasn't just panic. It was panic wrapped in privilege, shaking the air like a fire alarm. Heads turned immediately. People froze mid-step. Conversations died mid-word. The voice belonged to an older white woman in her 60s, dressed like royalty stepping off a private jet. A full-length mink coat swallowed her frame, diamonds sparkled from her ears, and her lipstick was blood red, too perfect to be smudged even now. She clutched an oversized Hermes handbag, rifling through it with exaggerated desperation, her rings clicking against gold zippers. Her performance was flawless. Manicured hands trembling just enough, voice cracking just right. This wasn't the first time Margot Fairchild had been the center of attention, and it showed. She looked around quickly, wildly. Not to find her purse, but to find someone to blame. Her gaze cut across the terminal, passing over suits, sweatpants, strollers, until it stopped. It locked, and then it struck. Her arms shot forward like a judge slamming a gavel. "Her!" she shrieked, voice rising in triumph and accusation. "That woman right there, she took it." Her finger aimed straight at Jasmine Crockett, standing 10 feet away, calm and unaware until now. "She walked right past me. I felt it. She bumped into me." Margot's voice trembled now with a mix of rage and certainty, the kind of tone that didn't invite doubt. It demanded action. Jasmine blinked. Her body didn't move, but something in the air around her changed. She wasn't confused. She was calculating. She understood exactly what had just happened. The terminal, once filled with random motion and anonymous faces, had suddenly become a courtroom, and she was on trial. Not for what she did, but for who she was. For the color of her skin, for standing near the wrong person at the wrong moment. The space around her seemed to tighten, like a lens narrowing. Conversations restarted, but now they were murmurs, all about her. Phone cameras tilted in her direction. A child asked their father, "What's happening?" And the father whispered something Jasmine couldn't hear, but she already knew what it was. Margot took a step forward, holding her open bag as if it were a smoking gun. "She's trying to walk away with it," she said, though Jasmine hadn't moved an inch. She was right next to me. "You people are good at this, slipping in and out like nothing happened." Jasmine's jaw clenched. Not because of fear, but because of the words "you people." That phrase landed harder than the accusation. It wasn't just about a purse anymore. It was about all the assumptions wrapped around Jasmine's skin, her gender, her presence. Her law degree didn't matter. Her federal court victories didn't matter. Her keynote speech on civil rights delivered 12 hours earlier? Useless now. None of it protected her from being seen exactly the way Margot chose to see her, as a threat in plain sight. The tension in the terminal built fast. Too fast. 1 second, she was just another traveler. The next, she was a suspect under silent indictment by 50 pairs of eyes. No one asked for proof. No one asked Jasmine what happened. Not even a glance toward her luggage, her hands, her path. The accusation was enough. It had already shaped the story in people's minds. Wealthy white woman victimized by a suspicious, well-dressed, but sneaky black woman. Jasmine felt it all in her chest. The pressure, the rage, the ache of a truth she knew too well. If she spoke too firmly, she'd be aggressive. If she stayed silent, she'd be evasive. Every move from this moment forward would be judged through a broken lens. Jasmine looked at Margot and finally spoke, her voice low, steady, and deadly precise. "I didn't take your purse," she said. "Check your things again before you make accusations you can't take back." But the damage had been done. All around her, people had already picked sides, and most weren't standing on hers. A businessman in a gray blazer leaned toward his wife and muttered, "She's too calm. That's suspicious." A young security officer across the terminal reached for his walkie, and Margot, emboldened by the growing audience, raised her voice again. "She's playing innocent. Don't let her leave," she shouted. Her face was red now, flaring with the righteous fury of someone who believed the world owed her instant validation, and it would get worse before it got better. Jasmine knew that. This wasn't the first time her dignity had been put on trial by strangers, but something in her spine stiffened. The same steel that had won her courtroom battles and scared men twice her size into silence. Her silence now wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Her expression didn't change, but inside she was already gathering every detail, every timestamp, every angle of every camera in this terminal. Because this time, she would be the one pressing charges. But Jasmine didn't even have time to respond to the crowd before the atmosphere shifted again. This time, heavier. The kind of heavy that comes with authority, with power walking in like it owns the air. The sound of boots hitting polished tile cut through the tension like a judge's gavel slamming down. 3 officers emerged from the far end of the terminal, moving fast, eyes locked on the scene ahead. The crowd made way instinctively, not out of respect, but out of fear. Because when uniforms moved like that, something was about to happen. Lieutenant Donald Huxley led the pack, his chest out, jaw tight, an expression carved from stone. He looked like a man who'd stopped listening years ago and started deciding instead. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask, didn't pause to read the room, because to him the room had already spoken. He walked like he already had the truth in his back pocket, and what he saw didn't surprise him. A sobbing white woman, a silent black one, and an open stage to exercise his authority. Behind him came Officer Tom Keller, younger, less certain, but trying to keep pace. He glanced at Huxley every few steps like a trainee following a senior into a war zone. His jaw was tight, eyes darting between Margot and Jasmine, unsure of how to read what he was seeing, but willing to follow orders if it meant staying out of trouble. The last in the formation was Officer Emma Ruiz, older than Keller, steadier in her movements, but not in her certainty. Her eyes flicked from the scene to the crowd, to Jasmine, to the phones now recording from the corners of the terminal. She wasn't blind. Something about this didn't feel right, but she said nothing. Not yet. Huxley's presence was too strong, and her silence had been trained into her like muscle memory. Huxley didn't ask a single question. Not to the woman yelling, not to the woman standing silently. He barely acknowledged Margot's flailing hands and tear-filled eyes before locking his gaze on Jasmine, his eyes cold and clinical. There was no curiosity, no attempt at due process. He wasn't trying to find out what happened. He was trying to prove what he already believed. And what he believed was simple. A black woman had been accused. She was alone. She was calm. Too calm. And that made her dangerous. That was all the evidence he needed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice like ice cracking under pressure. "Drop your bag. Step back. Show me your hands." The words came fast and flat, without emotion, like he was reading them from a checklist. His tone wasn't demanding justice. It was demanding compliance. Jasmine didn't move. Her heart pounded, but her body remained still. Her eyes locked on Huxley with professional precision, like she was already taking mental depositions. "Are you going to ask me what happened?" she asked, her voice firm but measured. "Or is this how you handle all accusations? No questions? Just action?" Huxley didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He waved one hand in the air like swatting a fly and looked to his subordinates. "She's the one," he said. "Search her, then cuff her." That was it. No pause, no explanation. Just a command dropped like a hammer. Jasmine felt her heart slam against her chest, not because she feared the cuffs, but because she had seen this exact moment play out in too many lives, too many headlines. She had fought this in courtrooms. She had lectured about this at universities. And now she was living it, in real time, in public, with strangers watching, filming, whispering. No Miranda rights, no investigation. Just a decision made the moment Huxley laid eyes on her. Ruiz hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Jasmine noticed. Ruiz's hand hovered near her belt, not in preparation, in uncertainty. Her posture shifted, slightly backward, as if she wanted to step out of the frame. She looked at Huxley, then at Jasmine, then at the crowd again. There were phones up now. There were witnesses. There was doubt. But she didn't act on it. She didn't stop it. Because hesitation without courage is silence, and silence protects power. Keller was already pulling out the handcuffs. His fingers fumbled slightly on the hinge, betraying nerves. He was young but not blind. Still, he moved, because orders were orders, and hesitation wasn't a luxury he thought he could afford. Jasmine raised her voice slightly, projecting not for Huxley, but for the cameras. "This is unlawful," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate. "No questions, no ID check, no surveillance review, just cuffs." The words rang out like a charge sheet, not just against the officers, but against the entire system. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was narrating a failure in progress for every camera in that terminal to record and remember. But Huxley had already tuned her out. "You think I care about your lectures?" he snapped, stepping forward until he was uncomfortably close. His breath hit her cheek. His tone was sharper now, baiting her. "What are you, a lawyer? A politician? Doesn't matter. You match the description. End of story." Jasmine narrowed her eyes. Her voice dropped low, almost a whisper. "What description exactly?" she said. "Black, female, standing too close to a white woman's purse?" But Huxley wasn't listening. He wasn't here to debate. He was here to dominate. He raised his voice just enough to draw a new hush across the crowd. "Final warning," he said. "Comply or we escalate. No specifics, no justification, just pure control, cold, mechanical, and practiced." Jasmine turned her head slightly and locked eyes with Ruiz. One last time, a final call for conscience. "This is your moment." But Ruiz looked down, and Jasmine knew. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed. The cuffs were cold, biting into her wrists, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice, clear and deliberate, cut through the murmuring crowd like a scalpel. "I am a U.S. citizen. I have rights. You are violating them." Her words weren't a protest. They were a declaration, carved from years of courtroom battles and civil rights lectures. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She asserted, with the tone of someone who had memorized the Constitution not as theory, but as weapon. "You had no warrant, no probable cause, no evidence, and no reason to put your hands on me," she said, her eyes locked on Huxley with unwavering force. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was tension thickening into threat. But Huxley didn't respond with law. He responded with rank. "You're cuffed," he said flatly. "That's all that matters." He stared at her not like a suspect, but like a challenge. Like he hated that she wasn't shaking, that she dared to look him in the eye with her back straight and her voice sharp. "This isn't a debate," he added, leaning in. "You're not in court now, sweetheart." Jasmine's jaw tightened, not because of the insult. She'd heard worse, but because of the way the badge on his chest seemed to grant him permission to ignore everything she'd said, everything she was. "No, I'm not in court," she replied, "which is exactly why this is happening. You'd never speak to me like this in front of a judge." Ruiz blinked. Keller shifted, but no one stepped in. Jasmine took a deep breath. Her wrists ached, but her voice stayed steady. "You didn't ask for my ID," she said. "You didn't ask what happened. You didn't verify a single word of that woman's story." Her eyes swept across the faces watching, then back to the officers. You saw a black woman standing near a white accuser, and that was all you needed. Her voice didn't tremble. It pierced. Every word calculated, crisp, undeniable. That's not justice. That's profiling. That's abuse of power. A few people in the crowd murmured. A man holding his phone muttered, "She's right." Another whispered, "Why won't they check the cameras?" Ruiz hesitated again, her hands hovering near Jasmine's blazer. There was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. Not defiance, but recognition. Jasmine saw it, seized it. "You don't have to follow an illegal order," she said calmly. "You can say no." Ruiz's lips parted, but no words came. She looked at Huxley, who didn't even look back. "Do your job," he barked. "We're not standing here all day while she gives us a TED Talk." Jasmine exhaled slowly. "You're not doing your job," she said, voice firm but even. "You're violating federal law, and you're doing it on camera." She nodded toward the nearest phone. "So I hope you're ready to explain it later. Under oath." Ruiz finally moved forward. Her fingers were hesitant, brushing the fabric of Jasmine's blazer, then pausing again. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't resist. Ruiz's hands were methodical, cautious, almost reluctant as they moved across Jasmine's torso. Not rough, not invasive, but not gentle either. This wasn't protocol. This was damage control disguised as procedure. Jasmine stood still, her chin slightly lifted, her jaw tight, eyes forward. She didn't resist, but she didn't shrink either. She didn't offer comfort. She offered truth. Ruiz reached the inside of Jasmine's blazer and felt something hard. Not round like a phone or square like a wallet. It was slim, solid, tightly tucked into the inner pocket with deliberate precision. She hesitated. Then slowly, like peeling open a box she already knew contained something dangerous, Ruiz reached in and pulled it free. A black leather credential holder, sleek, professional, worn just enough to prove it wasn't decorative. Ruiz opened the flap and froze. Inside was a federal identification badge, gleaming beneath the terminal's artificial lights. The gold seal of the United States Department of Justice was stamped in the center, bold and unmistakable. Next to it, encased behind clear plastic, was a government-issued ID card, complete with Jasmine's photo, full name, and multiple lines of authority. Jasmine Crockett, Eskers Bar Certified, Federal Circuit Licensed Attorney, National Level Advisor, Judicial Oversight Council. Ruiz's breath caught. Her eyes widened, flicking between the badge and Jasmine. Her hands lowered as if the item had suddenly become too heavy to hold. The color drained from her face. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the quiet way guilt creeps in when truth hits harder than force ever could. She turned toward Huxley, holding out the wallet like evidence from a crime scene. "Lieutenant," she said softly, "you need to see this." At first, Huxley didn't move. He was still watching Jasmine like she was a ticking bomb. But now the wires were visible, and he knew he'd cut the wrong ones. He took the wallet from Ruiz's hand without a word. His eyes dropped to the contents. 1 second, 2. And just like that, his jaw slackened. Gone was the iron authority, the loud certainty. It collapsed under the weight of those few laminated words. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. The silence was brutal. It wasn't the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of a man who knew he was absolutely, irreversibly wrong. Keller leaned in, curious, his youthful confusion quickly turning to horror as he saw the badge. He stepped back like he'd touched something electric, his face pale, his body stiff. "She's an attorney?" he mumbled, almost to himself. "A federal one?" Ruiz nodded once, still visibly shaken. "High clearance, judiciary level." Her voice was quiet but carried weight now. The weight of shame, of realization, of watching the truth land like a hammer on their credibility. Jasmine still hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Her hands were still cuffed, but her presence was towering. The power they tried to strip from her now radiated through every fiber of her stillness. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but devastating. "Do you want to keep going?" she asked. "Maybe you'll find my law school transcripts next, or the ethics award I got from the National Bar Association." Huxley said nothing. He was holding the wallet like it might explode. He looked up slowly, his face drained of arrogance, replaced now with something harder to fake. Fear. Real fear. Not of Jasmine, but of what she represented, of what this moment could become. The videos, the lawsuits, the hearings, the headlines. Ruiz shifted uncomfortably beside him, and Keller looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The power dynamic had flipped in an instant. Jasmine didn't yell. She didn't gloat. But the air around her crackled like electricity. The cameras were still rolling. The bystanders were still watching. And now they were watching them, the cops, squirm. Everything Huxley had tried to command, control, and crush was now staring him in the face. Laminated, official, and utterly unforgiving. The silence that followed Ruiz's trembling reveal of the badge was deafening. But Jasmine let it stretch. Let them sit in it. Let the discomfort settle on their skin like sweat under body armor. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't gloat. She simply let the truth breathe. Something they hadn't given her the chance to do. Her wrists were still locked in metal, her blazer slightly askew from the search, but her composure was bulletproof. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the three officers. Huxley, still holding the wallet with stiff fingers. Keller shrinking into himself like a child who'd broken something valuable. And Ruiz, standing rigid, ashamed, her eyes on the floor. Jasmine's expression didn't change, but the corners of her mouth lifted. Not into a grin, but a controlled, knowing curve. The kind of smile you give right before delivering a closing argument that ends careers. "Well," she said quietly, but loud enough for everyone around them to hear, "do any of you want to talk about rights now?" The words landed like a knife turned slowly in a wound. No one answered. "You ignored my voice," she continued, her tone razor-sharp but calm. "You ignored the Constitution. You chose instinct over facts, fear over procedure, and skin color over sense." Her hands shifted slightly in the cuffs, but she didn't ask to be released. Not yet. "You didn't just disrespect me," she added. "You disrespected the oath you swore when you pinned on that badge." Keller looked like he might cry. Ruiz looked like she wanted to disappear. Huxley's face was locked in a neutral mask, but his hands told the truth. Fingers clenched tighter around the badge. Knuckles pale. Jasmine raised one brow, then said evenly, "Let's make a call, shall we?" Slowly, deliberately, she brought her cuffed hands forward and reached into her blazer pocket, making sure every movement was controlled, visible, non-threatening. The crowd watched in total silence, phones still raised, some jaws hanging open. Jasmine fished out her phone and tapped in her passcode with muscle memory. 4 digits, 1 revolution. Her contact list opened, and she scrolled with her thumb until she found the name. Judge Annalise Whitmore. No hesitation, no second guessing, just one tap. Then she lifted the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving Huxley. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. "Judge Whitmore, it's Jasmine Crockett," she said, voice now clear and commanding. She spoke like she was back in federal court, floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, the seal of the United States hanging over her shoulder. "I'm calling from Denver International. I've been unlawfully detained and publicly humiliated by 3 uniformed officers who never asked for ID, never verified a claim, and never checked a single camera." She paused, letting that land. "I informed them I was a federal attorney. They ignored it. They've just discovered my credentials during an illegal search." Her tone didn't rise, but every word was a strike. Clean, deliberate, lethal. She paused again, listening. Then, "Yes. This is on video. Yes, there are dozens of witnesses." Huxley's face twitched, the first crack in his armor. Keller was now visibly shaking, and Ruiz had taken a half step back. Jasmine nodded once into the phone. "Understood. I'll remain here. I expect someone from the DOJ to contact airport security directly." Another pause. "Thank you, Your Honor." And she hung up. The motion was slow, final, like lowering a gavel. She slid the phone back into her jacket with precision, then looked directly at Huxley. Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. "You didn't want to hear me then, but you'll hear from them now." The cameras were still rolling. The crowd wasn't just filming a woman being wronged anymore. They were filming a system being held accountable in real time. "I hope you took good notes," she added softly, "because I promise you, this won't be the last time you're asked to explain what you did today." And for the first time since they'd arrived, none of the officers could bring themselves to speak. And then it happened. 30 minutes after the call, the tension snapped. The sliding doors at the far end of the terminal opened with a mechanical hiss, but the presence that entered felt anything but mechanical. Leading the group was a woman in a sleek navy suit, her DOJ badge gleaming at her waist, a federal enforcement patch stitched on her shoulder. She moved like someone who didn't speak unless she was about to change someone's future. On her left was a plainclothes officer, taller, older, face hard as carved granite, from the Office of Inspector General, Internal Affairs Division. On her right, a sharply dressed representative from Airport Administration, flanked by two airport security supervisors. No one announced them. They didn't need to. The entire crowd instinctively parted as they approached. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She just waited. Calm, composed, knowing this was what accountability looked like when it arrived wearing a suit instead of a badge. The federal agent stopped in front of Huxley. Her voice was clear, clipped, and professional. "Lieutenant Donald Huxley, Officer Thomas Keller, Officer Emma Ruiz. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all field duties." Her eyes didn't blink. "You are under active review for violations of federal civil rights protections, improper detainment, and abuse of authority. You are instructed to place your firearms, badges, radios, and any other department-issued equipment on the floor. Now." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Huxley's face twitched. The mask of authority he had worn so easily earlier was now cracking around the edges. He glanced toward Jasmine, and that, more than anything, said it all. She didn't flinch. She didn't return the look. She simply stared forward, as if daring him to say a single word. Keller moved first, hesitant. His hands shook as he unclipped his belt and carefully placed his holstered firearm and radio on the tile. He removed his badge last, staring at it like he couldn't believe it was leaving his hands. Ruiz followed slower, eyes glassy, mouth tight. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She knew. She unbuckled her duty belt, laid it down with a quiet clink, and stepped back like she wanted to fade into the floor. But Huxley, he waited, for a second too long, as if hoping this was all a bluff. As if waiting for someone to walk in and tell him this wasn't happening. But it was, and it wasn't going away. The federal agent took one step closer. "Lieutenant," she said again, this time lower, firmer. "This is not optional." Huxley's jaw locked. His fingers moved stiffly, mechanically, as he removed his weapon. Then his radio. Then finally his badge. The symbol he had used to crush someone's dignity without hesitation. He placed it down with deliberate force, like he could somehow reclaim control through the sound of metal on tile. But no sound could fix what had been broken. And now all eyes weren't on Jasmine anymore. They were on him, on what he'd done, on what it meant. The plainclothes officer stepped forward, collecting the surrendered gear into a large black evidence bag. No words, just procedure. Clean, cold, official. The airport representative then turned toward Jasmine, eyes flicking to the cuffs on her wrist with barely concealed horror. "Please remove those restraints immediately," he said, directing the command not to his staff, but to the officers who had applied them. No one moved, until Ruiz quietly stepped forward. Hands trembling, she pulled the key from her belt and unlocked the cuffs. First one wrist, then the other. The metal fell away with two soft clicks that somehow echoed louder than anything else. Jasmine didn't rub her wrists. She didn't thank them. She simply brought her hands to the front, fixed the sleeve of her blazer, and stood tall. She turned slightly toward the crowd, not for applause, not for validation, but so every phone filming could capture what accountability looks like when it finally shows up late, but dressed right. Then she looked directly at the federal agent. "Are we ready to file the formal report?" she asked, voice calm but unmistakably sharp. The agent nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. And this time, we'll start by asking you what happened." And with that, the balance of power was finally corrected. Not through apology, not through begging, but through truth, patience, and the unshakable strength of someone who refused to shrink, even when the system tried to make her disappear. As the final badge hit the floor and the weight of consequence settled over the room, another ripple broke through the crowd, quieter, but just as damning. A young airport security officer came jogging toward the cluster of officials, clutching something beige and bulky in his gloved hands. He looked pale, almost confused, like someone who'd just uncovered evidence from a crime that wasn't supposed to exist. He stopped short of the federal agent, glanced at Jasmine, then looked directly at the woman who had started it all. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Margot Fairchild, who now stood off to the side, still trying to hold on to the last shreds of her false indignation. "We found your purse." The words hit the terminal like a thunderclap. "It was lodged inside the lining of your coat, wedged between the silk and the inner seam. Nothing appears to be missing." Margot blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her hands twitched as the officer held out the bag. For a second, she didn't take it. Couldn't. Her fingers hovered just above the straps, like touching it would make the truth too real. Slowly, almost grudgingly, she accepted it, eyes never meeting Jasmine's. She opened the purse, looked inside. Credit cards, wallet, makeup, cash, all there. The air in the terminal changed again. This time it wasn't tension. It was realization. Raw, collective realization. Whispers turned into murmurs. Faces turned toward Margot with something colder than judgment. Disgust. She had pointed. She had lied. She had nearly destroyed someone's life over a moment of carelessness and a lifetime of entitlement. And through it all, Jasmine stood still. She didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She didn't say what everyone was thinking. She simply looked at the purse, then looked back at the room, and said with devastating calm, "If I didn't have that badge, would any of you have believed me?" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words settled into the air like smoke from a gun still warm. No one answered. They couldn't, because every person in that terminal already knew the truth. The echo of Jasmine's question, "Would any of you have believed me without that badge?" still hung in the air like smoke after a shot. No one had answered. No one could, because that wasn't a question. That was a statement of truth too sharp to be softened, too raw to be argued. And in that silence, decisions began forming behind closed doors. Over the next few days, headlines erupted. Videos went viral. Federal response teams issued public statements. News anchors debated whether justice had truly been served. Editorials called it everything from a tragic misunderstanding to an exposed nerve in American law enforcement. And while the nation argued over the viral footage of a black woman in cuffs who turned out to be a federal attorney, Jasmine Crockett sat in quiet rooms with legal boards, agency directors, and judicial committees. Not just as a victim, but as a force of accountability. Everyone had expected the firings to be swift, brutal, permanent. They weren't. Lieutenant Huxley, Officer Keller, and Officer Ruiz were not terminated immediately. There were internal discussions, union politics, legal reviews, technicalities were examined, precedents dissected. And in the end, the final ruling was announced not with drama, but in a sterile press briefing that left more questions than answers. All three officers would be placed under a 12-month intensive retraining and review program developed jointly by the Department of Justice, the Office of Civil Rights, and the Federal Judicial Review Board. To the public, it sounded like leniency. To Jasmine, it sounded like delay. But what came next would still test them in ways they never imagined. The program wasn't cosmetic, it wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't optional. From day one, the three officers were stripped of their weapons, their patrol responsibilities, and any authority over civilians. Instead, they were seated in windowless rooms for federal-level training on civil liberties, police accountability, implicit bias, and constitutional rights. Every morning began with a written quiz. Every afternoon involved hours of classroom instruction led by civil rights attorneys, sociologists, and community advocates, many of whom looked like Jasmine. Huxley hated it. His silence was thick with resentment. He never spoke unless called on, and even then his answers came clipped, defensive, like the law itself had betrayed him. Keller struggled. He took notes feverishly, asked questions clumsily, and flinched when instructors played footage from the airport. footage of him cuffing a federal attorney while nodding along to unlawful commands. Ruiz listened, quiet, focused. But her silence was different now. Not hesitation, but reckoning. On the third week, the officers were required to attend a panel titled, "When the System Fails You, Voices from the Margins." Jasmine wasn't on the panel, but her name came up, again and again, not just as a headline, but as a warning, as an example of what happens when procedure is replaced by prejudice. And then came the assignments. They weren't lectures, they were essays. Describe a time when you exercised power without verifying facts. How does implicit bias influence threat perception? If Jasmine Crockett had not revealed her credentials, what would the arrest report have said? The instructors didn't want apologies. They wanted introspection, blood-deep, bone-deep honesty. Most officers in similar programs treated it like a checklist. This one didn't let them. By month 4, the program got harder. Now came the simulation chambers, realistic scenarios built to expose how officers react under stress, confusion, and uncertainty. Actors played civilians of every race, age, background. The scenarios were designed not for speed, but for choice. In one room, Keller faced a black teenager yelling at an officer for harassing his brother. The actor reached into his hoodie. Keller hesitated, longer than he would have 6 months ago, but still drew his baton. The instructor paused the scene. "Let's rewind," she said. "Now imagine that kid is your nephew. Try again." In another exercise, Ruiz was forced to mediate a shouting match between a Latina mother and a white man threatening to call ICE. She paused. Tried empathy. She passed that one. Huxley failed 3 scenarios in a row, not because he made the wrong call, because he refused to make a new one. He stuck to instinct, protocol, authority. The instructors didn't care. "You followed the rule," one told him. "The rules are why you're here." Month 6 brought community immersion. Once a week, the 3 officers were required to meet with local leaders, clergy members, and racial justice advocates. Off duty, no uniform, no badge. One night, they sat in a rec center across from ex-offenders who had been racially profiled. Another night, they heard from public defenders, mostly black and brown women, who spent their careers undoing the kind of damage Huxley and Keller had caused in a single shift. Each meeting ended with a journal entry, signed and reviewed. If it sounded performative, it wasn't, because every entry had to be submitted to the Civilian Oversight Board, where Jasmine Crockett now served as an appointed legal advisor. She didn't see the officers, but she saw their words. She read Keller's entry from week 9. "I didn't realize how many times I've assumed guilt before asking a question. I see myself in every mistake I was trained not to make." She read Ruiz's entry from week 12. "I thought silence made me neutral. Now I see silence made me complicit." And she read Huxley's from week 14, short, bitter, resentful. "No amount of training will undo what this country needs to fix in its people." That was the first week his score dropped below passing. By month 9, consequences got real. Each officer was assigned a case review, a real incident involving misconduct by another officer. They had to present it to a panel, explain what went wrong, and what should have been done instead. Keller picked a 2019 airport case involving a false accusation, eerily similar to Jasmine's. His voice cracked halfway through. He still got through it. Ruiz chose a body cam review of a domestic dispute mishandled by an impatient officer. She ended her presentation with a line the panel wouldn't forget. "Being the quiet one doesn't make you the better cop. It just makes you the quieter danger." Huxley refused to complete his. He said it was political. He said it was a waste of time. The panel failed him for the quarter. By month 12, the review board convened. 3 files sat on a long table inside a federal building. One belonged to Keller, one to Ruiz, one to Huxley. Each file contained their performance scores, video logs, essays, journals, and peer evaluations. Each officer had to sit before a committee composed of legal experts, civil rights leaders, and 2 federal judges, and answer one final question. Why should you be trusted to wear a badge again? Keller spoke with humility. His voice was unsure but honest. He didn't ask for a second chance. He asked for a first one he hadn't realized he'd never earned. Ruiz was quiet, but clear. She didn't ask to be reinstated. She said, "If I do come back, I'll speak when others won't. And if I don't, I'll still fight for what's right, just not in a uniform." Huxley stared at the table. When asked the question, he answered, "Because I followed protocol." That was all he said, and it was all they needed to hear. Jasmine received the decision 3 days later in her inbox. Keller, conditional reinstatement with mandatory mentorship and quarterly reviews. Ruiz, approved for re-entry with limitations on supervisory roles. Huxley, terminated, permanently ineligible for law enforcement work nationwide. She read the report, closed the file, and finally, after a year of holding her breath, she exhaled. Because justice for once didn't arrive all at once. But this time, it didn't walk away either. The decision spread like wildfire. By noon, the official ruling had made national news. 3 officers, 1 permanently banned, 2 sent back for review and retraining. Jasmine's name trended for the 4th time in a month, this time not as the victim, but as the woman who'd held the mirror up to an entire institution. But with the exposure came the storm. Across newsrooms, classrooms, churches, and street corners, one question lit up conversations like a fuse. Was this justice? The city's reaction fractured instantly. Half saw reform, half saw retreat. The Justice Department released a statement defending the 12-month program as a rigorous, precedent-setting disciplinary structure rooted in education, accountability, and long-term change. It detailed the coursework, the mandatory psychological evaluations, the community engagement requirements. Officials cited Keller and Ruiz's compliance, their journals, their progress. "We are not in the business of punishment for show," the statement read. "We are in the business of transformation." For some, that landed. For others, it sounded like a carefully worded excuse. Civil rights groups were divided. Some veteran advocates took a measured stance. "This is the first time we've seen law enforcement placed under long-term civilian educational review," one organizer said on live television. "If this model works, it could change the system from the inside out." Others were less forgiving. "If this is what justice looks like for a high-profile attorney with federal credentials and video proof, what chance does a working-class black man have with none of that?" said one young activist into a wall of microphones outside the city courthouse. The tension rippled through every demographic, every age group. Those who'd fought too long to believe in change couldn't celebrate something that still felt like survival. And those desperate for progress were clinging to any sign of forward motion, even if it was slow, incomplete, and uncomfortable. On community radio stations, callers lined up to voice their thoughts. An elderly black man broke down in tears on air. "When I saw those cuffs on her, it was like watching my granddaughter get arrested for breathing," he said. "I don't care about training. I care about accountability." A white retired police captain called in from the suburbs, voice sharp with frustration. "They didn't fire them because they know that firing wouldn't fix the culture. You want real change? Then you've got to rewire people, not just replace them." The host let the line go quiet for a moment, letting listeners sit with the contradiction. Both men were right, and both were exhausted. Protests reignited downtown, not massive, but relentless. Day after day, people gathered outside the police union headquarters with signs that didn't mince words. "Education isn't consequence." If she didn't have a badge, she'd have a record. No justice, no quiet. And then there were the counter voices, letters to editors, talk show hosts, comment sections full of fury. Some accused Jasmine of grandstanding. Others claimed the officers had been ruined for doing their jobs. "What's the point of policing if you're going to get punished for acting fast?" one angry caller asked on conservative radio. The host replied, "Acting fast is different than acting right," and they didn't. But that didn't stop the narrative from spinning out. That Jasmine had overreached, that the punishment was political, that the training program was just a backdoor firing without due process. Jasmine watched the chaos unfold not from a podium, but from behind her office door. She read the coverage. She saw the hashtags. She heard the praise, and the resentment, and the fatigue. And through it all, she said very little. The cameras were still chasing her, but she didn't run toward them. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. Symbols are clean. Jasmine was not. She was still bruised, still tired, still walking into courtrooms where she could see the same assumptions in the eyes of strangers, the kind that don't vanish just because a name trends for a week. She attended a closed-door meeting with the DOJ Advisory Council 2 weeks after the ruling. They asked her how she felt about the disciplinary outcomes. She paused, not for effect, but for honesty. "It's a beginning," she said, "but beginnings don't feel like victories when you had to bleed to get them." One member nodded. Another wrote it down. No one pushed back. Outside, the city continued to argue with itself. Some called her story inspiring. Others called it a warning. A few still refused to see the problem. But no one, not one person, could pretend it didn't happen. Because now the video existed. Because now her name was written into the city's memory. Because now the phrase, "you match the description," had met its match. The office was still. No cameras, no microphones, no crowds or questions. Just Jasmine, just the report. And a silence so deep it almost pulsed. The final page of the DOJ investigation rested beneath her fingertips. Her eyes didn't move, but her mind was racing, not with triumph, not with relief, but with something heavier, a slow, sinking truth that even a formal declaration of innocence, even the suspension of officers, even national headlines hadn't managed to erase the most bitter part of it all. If she hadn't had that badge, she wouldn't be sitting here right now. She'd be forgotten, or fighting for her name, or worse. She leaned back slowly in her chair, the leather groaning under her as if echoing her exhaustion. The city glittered outside her window, oblivious. The same city that had watched her get handcuffed like a common criminal, then shifted uncomfortably when the truth came out. They called it a victory, a rare win for justice. But she knew better. Because justice that only comes when you wear a title, when your ID opens doors, when you look like you belong, that's not justice. That's a loophole. And Jasmine Crockett had spent her whole life closing those. Her eyes wandered to the bookshelf across the room, framed degrees, law books, a glass award engraved with her name from the National Bar Association. They were meant to symbolize protection, credibility, but that day, none of them had mattered until the moment a badge flashed. Her mind drifted unwillingly back to that airport, back to the cuffs, back to the way the officers' eyes changed when they saw her credentials, from power to panic, from righteous to ruined. She remembered the pause, the silence, the terror in their expressions when they realized they had picked the wrong one. Not because they'd made a mistake, but because their mistake had consequences. Because the woman they tried to break had tools to fight back. But what if she hadn't? That question dug its claws deeper the longer she sat with it. She stood, walked across the office, opened a cabinet drawer she hadn't touched in weeks. Inside were thick files, civil suits, depositions, transcripts from years of court cases. Most had settled. Some had disappeared. All had one thing in common. They were people who looked like her, but unlike her, they didn't have law degrees, federal IDs, or access to media. They were names the world wouldn't remember, faces that never went viral. She pulled out a folder marked Mitchell versus City of Chicago, excessive force. Inside was a photo, a teenage boy with a split lip and a stare far too old for his age. He never got a formal apology, no statement, no training program. He got a bruised jaw, a misunderstanding, and a sealed settlement agreement. Another file, Reyes v. State Troopers. A mother stopped on her way to a food bank, accused of theft, detained with her daughter. No charges, just fear, just silence. Jasmine closed her eyes. She could still hear the echoes of their voices, still feel the injustice humming under her skin. And she knew her story had gone public because it made good headlines. But the real crisis, the real story was still happening, every day, unseen, undocumented, unchallenged. She pressed a hand to her chest and inhaled, slowly, then opened her laptop. This wasn't about her anymore. It never had been. She spent the next 72 hours writing, planning, sketching, not for a lawsuit, not for a book deal, for something bigger, a new kind of program, one that didn't rely on policy binders or performative lectures, One that didn't let anyone sit in a chair and nod their way through an hour-long slideshow before signing off as reformed. This would be different. It had to be. She outlined the pillars carefully. 1. Real stories, not simulations. Body cam footage, victim interviews, closed case evidence reviewed publicly. 2. Accountability exercises. Every officer required to analyze their own past decisions, challenge their assumptions, and reflect. In writing, on camera, in front of peers. 3. Civilian-led discussions. No chain of command, no uniforms, just people sitting across from one another, face-to-face, stripped of rank. 4. Emotional impact training. Not facts, but feeling. Not just the law, but what it feels like when the law fails you. 5. No exemptions. Rookies, veterans, supervisors. Everyone goes through it. Everyone answers. She titled it, Law and Perception, Breaking the Cycle Before It Begins, and in smaller font beneath, created and led by Jasmine Crockett, S.K. By the time she made the first call to pitch the concept, her voice was steady, cold even. She wasn't asking anyone for permission. She was informing them of what came next. She booked a pilot series with a police department in New Jersey, then another in Atlanta, then one in Texas. Some chiefs welcomed it. Some pushed back. She didn't care. She wasn't in the business of comfort. She was in the business of interruption. Each session opened with the same line. You've all learned how to control a suspect. I'm here to teach you how not to create one. No one clapped, no one joked. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Because by the end of each day, every officer had looked at the screen and seen themselves. Reflected not as heroes, not as villains, but as humans with power they didn't always understand. Jasmine made them watch her footage, frame by frame, pause, rewind, break it down. Then she asked the question that still echoed in her bones. If I didn't have that badge, what would you have done to me? By month 3, departments began requesting access. By month 6, the DOJ sent observers. By month 9, Jasmine had hired a full-time staff. And yet, every night, after the lights were off and the cities had quieted, she came back to the same thought, the same fire. That justice didn't happen in courtrooms. It happened when someone chose to see a person before a profile. It happened when the law stopped reacting and started listening. It happened when the system didn't need to be sued to admit it was wrong. And until that became the standard, not the exception, Jasmine would keep teaching. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Because somewhere out there, someone was being judged by the way they walked, the way they dressed, the way they looked, and they wouldn't have a badge to save them. But maybe, just maybe, they'd meet an officer who had sat in Jasmine's classroom, and that might be enough to change everything. The greatest takeaway from Jasmine Crockett's ordeal isn't just the revelation that law enforcement can err. It's the brutal reminder of how quickly injustice can strike when bias replaces proof. She stood in that airport, an accomplished attorney, yet still felt the sting of dehumanization the moment someone pointed a finger and screamed, "Thief!" Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that labels, even prestigious ones, only matter if the system feels pressured to recognize them. Without that badge in her coat pocket, her defense might have been drowned out by prejudice and panic. This high-stakes narrative peels back the layers of society's reliance on split-second judgments, challenging us to ask how many voices are silenced simply because they lack the right credentials. It reminds us that justice isn't a static idea, but a precarious balance that can tip based on who stands before it. Jasmine's resilience in the face of false accusation underscores a larger issue, that everyday citizens, stripped of power or status, risk being swallowed whole by systemic biases. By refusing to crumble when humiliated, she revealed not only the cruelty of assumption, but also the power of one unshakable truth. And that truth is this: if a person with her influence can nearly be devoured by a flawed system, imagine how many are consumed daily with no recourse at all. From the moment Jasmine was forced into handcuffs, we saw the stark reality of how easily suspicion can override basic rights. That visceral image of a well-dressed woman, deserving of dignity, being treated like a dangerous criminal, cracks open the question, what if she had been someone with no legal background, no federal connections, no media spotlight? The tension soared when everyone assumed guilt before evidence, demonstrating how fragile innocence becomes when prejudice is allowed to roam unchecked. Yet the most haunting aspect of her story is that she won, not by simply proving her truth, but by wielding a badge that spoke louder than her skin color. This is a moral lesson etched in pain, showing us that credentials can function as a flimsy barrier, protecting some and leaving others to face the storm alone. By highlighting the ease with which false accusations can take root, Jasmine's predicament confronts us with a moral imperative: to demand a world in which justice doesn't hinge on rank, title, or any external advantage. Her calm defiance in the face of that humiliating arrest became the foundation for a larger conversation about how we define credibility and whose voices we invalidate without a second thought. In that sense, her story doesn't end with a personal victory. It evolves into a resonant message about reimagining accountability. Because if her voice only mattered once her ID appeared, then the question remains, whose stories go unheard when no ID is present? The film-like intensity of her standoff with law enforcement underscores a broader societal dilemma. When does suspicion become systematic abuse, and who pays the highest cost? Each tense moment, her unwavering gaze, the crowd's collective hush, the officer's immediate readiness to believe Margot, reveals a machine operating on autopilot, set to target those who fit the profile. We're drawn to the screen, hearts pounding, because deep down we recognize that the real danger isn't just one crooked cop or one frightened accuser. It's a structure that enables snap judgments to carry the weight of law. At the core of this story lies a simple yet devastating truth. Injustice doesn't need time to root. It just needs enough fear and bias to look away from facts. If Jasmine's badge and legal standing momentarily pierce that shield of ignorance, the entire spectacle forces us to confront what happens when ordinary citizens, lacking her armor, collide with the same system. Her story stands as a condemnation of complacency, an insistence that we cannot rely on good intentions alone to rectify deep-seated biases. The lesson is jarring, that power in the wrong hands can suffocate justice in seconds, and that authority does not always equal righteousness. Ultimately, the tension we feel witnessing her ordeal is the tension of a society teetering on the edge. Do we uphold a fair standard for everyone, or let prejudice continue to direct the spotlight of suspicion? Yet for all the darkness woven into Jasmine's encounter, there is a seed of transformation embedded in her response. She doesn't merely walk away, satisfied that her personal case is resolved. Instead, she repurposes the trauma, seizing the disbelief, the anger, and the frustration, and channels them into a force that can reshape the very system that wronged her. This shift from victim to architect of reform is a crucial dimension of her journey. It punctuates the moral of the story with a powerful call to action, reminding us that despair can be transformed into something constructive. By establishing a training program and insisting on deeper examinations of bias, she defies the narrative that injustices should be quietly filed away after the headlines fade. Her approach isn't about demonizing every officer. It's about confronting a culture of assumptions that silently allows countless innocent people to be dehumanized. In a world so quick to broadcast failures, Jasmine's persistent effort to rebuild trust through education and honest confrontation emerges as a testimony that even within the ugliest moments, the potential for change still burns. And so her victory isn't just a personal vindication, it's a rallying cry for every individual who has ever been dismissed, doubted, or distorted by prejudice. Ultimately, the human lesson woven through Jasmine Crockett's story underscores a dual truth. No one should need a badge to be believed, and everyone deserves a system that protects them rather than suspects them. The tension we feel from the start, watching her move through the airport as an accomplished attorney, yet instantly marked for suspicion by a single accusation, mirrors the tension that millions experience daily without any safety net. Her ordeal begs us to examine how fragile our notions of justice become when color, gender, and status overshadow facts and fairness. It reveals the emotional toll inflicted when entire systems treat certain lives as disposable, while others are presumed safe. We see that Jasmine's triumph, powerful though it may be, is tinged with the sorrow of knowing how close she came to vanishing into handcuffs in a cell like so many before her. She emerges resolute, forging a path of education and advocacy because she cannot escape the haunting thought, what if this happened to someone who couldn't fight back? And indeed, that is the single question that rings louder than any judge's gavel, commanding us to reflect, to re-examine, and to reshape our world. In the end, her fight for truth is bigger than one wrongful arrest. It's a blueprint for awakening a system grown too comfortable in its biases. The lesson is bold and inescapable. Until justice is guaranteed for those without a badge, no badge in the world can truly claim to represent justice. Now that the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's fierce confrontation with systemic injustice have rippled through every corner of the nation, the time for passive outrage and quiet acceptance is definitively over. We can no longer wait for another brutal televised arrest or another quiet, anonymous burial of truth in dusty court dockets, while everyday people, stripped of rank or title, endure the suffocating weight of assumed guilt. It's time to reach beyond the fleeting headlines and hashtag movements, to galvanize communities at every level, forge cross-cutting alliances, and demand policy overhauls that pierce the rotten heart of this failing framework. Picture your mother, your neighbor, or your closest friend standing alone in that airport corridor with no camera and no commanding voice, battered by prejudice and utterly powerless to stop it. Ask yourself if their existence deserves less protection or respect simply because they lack the credentials that spark immediate fear in a corrupt system determined to uphold bias. We must pressure lawmakers into instituting mandatory checks on reckless detentions, champion body cam transparency for all law enforcement encounters, and expand civilian oversight boards with the real power to hold entire departments accountable. We must flood town halls, engage with local council meetings, write impassioned letters, and refuse to let complacency smother the righteous anger that has finally burned awake inside us. Stand by Jasmine's example, not just by sharing her story online, but by echoing her resolve to dismantle the insidious bias that taints our institutions from the inside out. Educate yourself, intervene when others remain silent, and champion the kind of sweeping reforms that ensure no one ever needs a badge to prove they are worthy of dignity. Our collective voice can transform the tremors of her solitary victory into an unstoppable wave of justice. But only if we choose to rise together, here and now, and refuse to stand down. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.